Hey everyone, get ready because we are diving deep into the Japanese language today.
I'm excited to be here.
We're talking all about politeness levels and honorifics and the history of Japanese, which I've heard is incredible.
It's a fascinating language, that's for sure. So much to unpack.
Well, let's start with something that's always blown my mind, these politeness levels in Japanese. I was reading that there are 4 distinct levels. 4. As an English speaker, I can barely handle please and thank you. Can you explain what makes these levels so unique?
It's really about choosing how you're speaking based on who you're talking to and the situation. It's like, you wouldn't wear a ball gown to a casual party, right?
So it's not just being polite, it's about your place in the conversation and with the people around you.
Absolutely. You have the plain form, which is super casual, just for close friends.
Yeah.
And then the polite form, which is like your everyday default.
Okay, that makes sense, but it doesn't stop there, right?
Right. Then it gets really interesting with the respectful and humble forms.
Okay, those sound intense. So, how would you even say something like to eat in all these different ways?
Okay, so let's say you're out with your best friend. You might just say taberu, real casual.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were having dinner with your boss, you probably say tabemasu, which is more polite.
I see. So you're switching it up depending on how formal you need to be.
Right. Now imagine you're with someone way up there, like a respected elder. Then you might use mishiagaru, super respectful.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
And then to be super humble, like if someone offered you food, you might say itaraku.
It's incredible how much meaning one little verb can have. This reminds me, when I was first learning Japanese, I tried to compliment a chef on her ramen, and I meant to say umai, which is delicious. But I think I accidentally used the more formal oishi, and let's just say I don't think she was impressed.
It definitely highlights how these levels aren't just grammar rules. They show deeper cultural values.
Respect, knowing your place. It's fascinating. Which leads us to something else I find so interesting about Japanese, these honorifics. They go way beyond Mr. and Ms., right?
Oh, absolutely. Honorifics are essential in showing respect and understanding those social hierarchies that are so important in Japan.
So it's like a little label you attach to someone's name that tells everyone your relationship with them.
Exactly. Using san is like our Mr. or Ms, a sign of respect, good for most people. But then there's kun, used often with boys or young men or in some workplaces.
I've heard of tian too, right?
Yeah, chan shows closeness, used with kids or close female friends. How you use these little additions speaks volumes about social dynamics.
It makes me wonder, is it ever okay not to use an honorific? Would that be super rude?
That's a really good question. It's all about context.
Haha.
With strangers or superiors, definitely not. But with close friends or family, dropping honorifics can actually show closeness, like you're saying. We're good, no need for formalities here.
So it's like your own little secret language code with your close friends.
Exactly. It all comes back to reflecting your relationship with the person you're talking to.
This is making me realize that even if you don't become fluent in Japanese, understanding these subtleties of politeness and honorifics gives you a whole new perspective on the culture itself.
It really does. It's like having a key to decode those unspoken rules that are everywhere.
It's like you're seeing the Matrix.
Yeah.
But speaking of cultural background, I'm really curious to dig into the history of the Japanese language itself. I hear it's quite a journey.
Oh, it definitely is. Are you ready to travel back in time?
Let's do it. Okay, so we're diving into the history of Japanese, and from what I've heard, it's got a pretty wild past with influences from all over. Where do we even start?
Well, we got to go way, way back. Think centuries ago to the Japanese archipelago before anything was written down. That's where we find the origins, with a language called, get this, Proto-Japonic.
Proto-Japonic. Sounds kind of mysterious. Who are these Proto-Japonic speakers? Where'd they come from?
Oh, that's the million-dollar question. Linguists are still trying to figure out all the details, but the main theory is these Proto-Japonic speakers, they came from somewhere on the Korean peninsula, probably between the 4th century BC and mid-4th century BC.
So they sailed across, bringing their language and culture, and that became the foundation for Japanese.
Pretty much. But it's important to remember they weren't arriving in a totally empty land. Japan was already inhabited by the Jomon people, who had their own cultures going back thousands of years.
Ah, right, the Jomon period. I remember seeing their pottery in museums. It's amazing. But if they didn't have a writing system, how do we know about their language?
That's the tricky part. It's really tough to piece together the linguistic puzzle without written records. It's likely that Proto-Japonic became the dominant language over time, but...
But there were exceptions.
Yeah, there's actually a really interesting one, the Ainu language. The Ainu people are indigenous to Japan, mainly up north in Hokkaido and over in parts of Russia. Their language gives us a glimpse of what existed before Proto-Japonic arrived.
Wow, a direct link to Japan's really ancient past. That's incredible, though it's kind of sad that it's considered endangered now.
It really is. It shows just how much impact cultural shifts can have on languages over time. But getting back to our timeline, we've got this Proto-Japonic base, and things are about to get really interesting.
Oh, why is that?
Because, fast forward a few centuries to around the 5th century AD, and bam, here comes the Chinese writing system.
Whoa, talk about game changer. I can't even imagine what that must have been like. Did people just start, mixing Chinese and Japanese together?
Well, not overnight, but you're on the right track. Think about it. For centuries, Japanese was all spoken, passed down through generations orally. Suddenly you have this incredibly complex writing system arriving on the scene. It was a huge deal.
So how did they even begin to adapt a writing system that was meant for a totally different language?
It was a slow process, for sure. At first, the elites, they used classical Chinese for all their official stuff, documents, literature. But over time, they started borrowing Chinese characters, called kanji, to try to represent Japanese words and sounds.
Hold on, so they were using characters designed for one language to write a completely different one? That sounds so confusing.
Oh, it definitely was. It was actually pretty ingenious if you think about it. This early system, it's called Manyugana, and it's the ancestor of the writing system they use in Japanese today.
Manyugana. Try saying that 3 times fast.
Yeah.
But, okay, so they're using kanji for both meaning and sound. How did that even work?
Well, that's the beauty of language, right? It changes, it adapts. Out of this Manyugana system came 2 new writing systems, hiragana and katakana.
3 writing systems. Okay, now I'm really lost. How do they all fit together?
Think of it like this. You've got your toolbox, right? Kanji, those are your heavy hitters, the nouns, the verbs, the big, meaningful words. Hiragana, that's your grammar, your verb endings, all those little words that connect everything together.
Okay, so what about katakana? What's its job?
Katakana, that's for all the new kids on the block. Any words borrowed from other languages, especially English, those get written in katakana.
So, if I wanted to write ramen, which I'm pretty sure wasn't originally a Japanese word, I'd use katakana.
Exactly. It's how Japanese integrates words from outside.
Man, that is a lot to keep track of. I can't imagine trying to learn all that.
It's definitely a challenge, but it also makes the language incredibly expressive, And just think, even a basic understanding of how it all works gives you a much deeper appreciation for Japanese culture and history.
It's amazing how we went from talking about ancient languages to modern writing systems. It really shows how connected it all is. But speaking of cultural connections, we were talking about those gendered speech patterns in Japanese earlier. I'm so curious to learn more about that.
Ah, yes. Just when you thought you were getting a handle on things,
Right.
Japanese throws another curveball.
Right, so tell me everything. What are we talking about here? So, gendered speech in Japanese. It's like a whole other level of complexity, right? We're not just talking about different pronouns, are we?
You hit the nail on the head. It goes way deeper than just pronouns. It's like woven into the very fabric of how people speak.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Give me the rundown. What are we talking about here?
Well, think about it. Even beyond specific words, there's intonation, sentence endings. Even the tone of voice can change depending on whether a man or a woman is speaking.
So it's not just what you say, it's how you say it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And all of these subtle cues work together to signal gender identity through speech.
It reminds me of how even in English, you just know if someone sounds more masculine or feminine sometimes, even if you can't quite put your finger on why.
Right. Like a woman might be more likely to say, "Oh, that's so lovely," while a man might say, "That's pretty cool. It's subtle, but it's there."
Totally. It's like this whole other layer of communication is happening under the surface. But these gendered speech patterns, do they ever change? I mean, language evolves, right? Speaking of which, we were talking about Kogel slang earlier, that whole movement in the 90s.
Oh yeah, the Kogels, they were all about pushing boundaries, and language was a big part of that.
It seemed like they were really challenging those traditional norms, but did their slang actually stick around, or was it just a fad?
Well, some of the more, shall we say, creative terms have faded away, but the impact of Kogel slang goes way beyond a few words.
How so?
They prove that language isn't this set-in-stone thing. It can be flexible, adaptable, even rebellious. The Kogels showed that, even in a culture as traditional as Japan, language can be used to challenge the status quo.
So even if people aren't walking around using Kogel slang every day, it left a mark on the language.
Absolutely. It opened up this whole new way of thinking about language, especially for younger generations. It's like they gave everyone permission to play with language, to bend the rules, and express themselves in new and creative ways.
It's kind of inspiring when you think about it. This small group of young women using language to make their voices heard and change the world around them, it makes you realize how powerful language can be.
Without a doubt, language is constantly changing, reflecting the world around it. And it's that constant evolution that makes studying languages so fascinating, don't you think?
I totally agree. It's been an amazing journey exploring the Japanese language with you today. From politeness levels and honorifics to the evolution of the writing system and those fascinating gendered speech patterns, we've really delved into some fascinating territory.
It's been a pleasure sharing my passion for Japanese with you and your listeners. It's such a rich and complex language, and I hope this deep dive has inspired everyone to learn a little more about it.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, if you could take away just one thing from today's deep dive, what would it be?
That's a tough one. I guess I'd say this. Remember that language isn't just about words and grammar. It's a reflection of culture, history, and values. So the next time you encounter a new language, approach it with an open mind and a sense of curiosity. You never know what you might discover.
Well said. And on that note, we'll be signing off for today. A huge thank you to our expert for joining us on this fascinating linguistic adventure.
My pleasure. It's been a lot of fun.
And to our amazing listeners, keep those brains engaged and those curiosities piqued. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a new and exciting topic. Until then, happy exploring.